Right now, an invisible multi-billion-dollar wall sits directly on the United States northern border. And no, it has nothing to do with trade tariffs, border patrols, or physical barriers. It has everything to do with money. For years, the public has assumed that American mega banks are financial conquerors, easily dominating every market they enter. But there is one massive, highly profitable country right next door where these financial giants have been quietly but firmly stopped in their tracks. That country is Canada. Most people have no clue that Canada has engineered a banking system so heavily guarded and so tightly controlled that it essentially blocks out the biggest financial institutions in the United States. If someone walks down a busy street in any major Canadian city, they will see a massive bank on almost every corner. But looking closely at the names on those buildings reveals a shocking truth. There is no Chase Bank. There is no Bank of America. There is no Wells Fargo retail branch handing out checking accounts to local residents. This is not an accident. This is by design. The story of how Canada quietly blocked United States banks from taking over its local market is one of the most brilliant and ruthless financial defense strategies in modern history. The Canadian government will quickly point out that American banks are technically allowed to operate inside their borders. And on paper, that is true. A handful of American banks do exist there, but they are trapped in a financial straitjacket. They are strictly limited in what they can do, who they can serve, and how much power they can hold. To understand why this silent blockade exists, one must look at the terrifying difference between how the United States handles money and how Canada handles money. It comes down to one simple word: fear. The Canadian government looked at the American banking system, saw a roller coaster of high-risk gambling, and decided they would never let that chaos cross their borders. The result? A silent banking war that the United States is losing. To truly grasp the genius behind this invisible wall, one simply needs to look at the scoreboard. Since the year 2001, the United States has watched hundreds of its banks completely collapse and fail. Communities lost local branches, and the government had to step in with massive bailouts to save the economy from totally melting down. Now look at Canada during that exact same time period. Zero, not a single major bank failure, not one. Canada achieved this perfect survival record by setting up rules that make the American way of banking completely incompatible within their borders. In the United States, banks are allowed to play fast and loose. They only have to hold a small percentage of cash in reserve to back up their risky investments, but Canada demands absolute financial armor. If a foreign bank wants to do business in Canada, it must lock away a massive mountain of cash as a safety net. This is called a capital buffer. Canadian rules require a safety net that is nearly double what the United States demands. For American banking giants, this is a total deal breaker. They make their billions by moving money quickly, taking big risks, and keeping as little cash in the vault as legally possible. When they look at the Canadian market, they realize they would have to freeze billions of dollars just to open their doors to everyday people. It simply does not make financial sense for them. But the roadblock does not stop there. Canada has also handed over total control of its entire financial system to a monopoly known as the Big Six. Six massive Canadian-owned banks control over 90% of all the money in the country. And the government has passed strict laws making it impossible for a foreign company to just buy one of these Big Six banks and take over. An American mega bank cannot swoop in with a giant checkbook and buy a path to the top. They are locked out of the VIP room, forced to watch from the outside, while Canadian banks reap all the profits. This invisible fortress does not just stop at strict government regulations. It reaches deep into the everyday lives of the citizens themselves. For decades, the Canadian public has been conditioned to trust only their own institutions. A deep-rooted loyalty exists toward these domestic giants, but this loyalty comes with a massive hidden price tag, because American banks and other foreign competitors are effectively shut out. There is absolutely no real competition. And when there is no competition, the consumer always pays the price. Every single month, average citizens in Canada are hit with banking fees that would make most Americans furious. Simply holding a checking account and making a certain number of debit transactions or transferring money comes with a strict monthly charge. In the United States, fierce competition forces banks to offer free checking accounts, giant sign-up bonuses, and no-fee credit cards just to steal customers from the bank across the street. In Canada, the big six do not have to fight for customers. They already own them. The government knows exactly what is happening. They are fully aware that everyday people are paying top dollar just to access their own money. Yet regulators look the other way entirely. Why? Because the Canadian government has made a cold, calculated trade. They have decided that sacrificing free markets and forcing citizens to pay higher fees is entirely worth it, as long as the banking system never collapses. They have traded innovation and cheap financial services for absolute unbreakable stability, and the plan works flawlessly. During global financial panics, while Wall Street executives are sweating over the threat of bankruptcy, Canadian bank executives are sleeping peacefully. Their system is a fortified bunker. But while this bunker keeps the bad actors out, it also locks the citizens inside with a financial monopoly that answers to almost no one. The citizens are trapped in a golden cage, paying a premium simply to use their own hard-earned cash. To make sure this financial fortress never falls, the government created a master rule that completely paralyzes any foreign invader. It is known in financial circles as the widely held rule. The strict law dictates that no single shareholder, whether it is a billionaire individual, a massive investment fund, or a powerful foreign bank, can own more than 20% of any large Canadian bank. And if a titan of Wall Street wanted to secretly buy up shares and stage a hostile takeover of a Canadian institution, it would be legally impossible. The law forces ownership to be scattered among millions of regular investors. This rule acts as an impenetrable shield. It guarantees that the control of the nation's wealth remains safely inside the borders, securely in the hands of the Canadian people and their pension funds. Furthermore, the gatekeeper of this entire system is an ultra-strict regulatory body that watches everything, while regulators south of the border are often accused of being too friendly with the massive banks they are supposed to police. This Canadian regulator operates with an absolute iron fist. They scrutinize every single move the big six make, demanding intense stress tests and enforcing rules that are universally considered some of the toughest on the planet. Because of these extreme measures, the giant financial institutions of the United States have essentially surrendered. They have looked at the massive cash requirements, the impossible takeover laws, and the suffocating regulations, and they have walked away. Instead of trying to open retail branches and offer checking accounts to regular citizens, the few American banks that do operate up north stick strictly to the shadows. They quietly handle corporate wealth management, investment banking for mega corporations, and high-level stock trades. They have accepted utter defeat in the consumer market. The United States banks know they will never conquer the Canadian high street. The invisible wall has proven far too thick and the regulatory moat far too deep. While this invisible wall keeps the economy incredibly safe, it also creates a massive blind spot that the rest of the world is starting to notice when a country blocks out the fierce, cutthroat competition of the American banking sector. It also blocks out the desperate need to innovate. Down in the United States, tech companies and massive banks are in a daily, brutal war for survival. That war forces them to invent better phone apps, faster ways to send money, and cutting-edge financial tools just to keep their customers happy. But up north, the big six Canadian banks do not have to fight that war because they own the entire market and are protected by the government. They have very little reason to rush into the future for years. Financial critics have pointed out that Canadian banking technology has often lagged behind the rest of the modern world. Simple things that Americans take for granted, like fierce battles over high-yield savings accounts or incredibly cheap digital banking options, are heavily muted across the border. The lack of American competition means the major Canadian banks can move at their own comfortable speed. They do not have to spend billions of dollars every single year trying to outsmart a rival from Wall Street. They simply upgrade their systems when they feel like it. This slow pace is the hidden tax of a monopoly. It is a trade-off that the government forces its citizens to accept. The priority is never about having the flashiest new technology or the most exciting financial gadgets. The priority is simply making sure the vault never breaks open. And the truth is, the major American banks are entirely fine with this arrangement. Wall Street executives know that fighting their way into the Canadian retail market would be a bloodbath with very little reward. The cost of entry is simply too high. It would require breaking through an absolute wall of red tape, locking up massive amounts of capital, and fighting a media war against deeply trusted local giants. To truly appreciate the sheer scale of this invisible blockade, one must zoom out and look at the entire global map. American mega banks are financial conquerors on a planetary scale. They have successfully planted their flags in financial capitals all across Europe, Asia, and South America. They have rewritten the rules of global trade and established themselves as the undisputed kings of international finance. Yet, directly to their north, sharing the longest undefended border in the entire world, lies a highly lucrative market they simply cannot crack. It is a fascinating paradox. The United States and Canada share a language, a massive trading partnership, and completely intertwined cultures. Citizens cross the border by the millions every single year. Yet when a dollar bill crosses that exact same line, it enters an entirely different universe. The Canadian government has looked at the American financial empire, an empire that has swallowed up markets across the globe, and flatly said no. This rejection is not born out of hostility or political spite. It is a strictly calculated survival mechanism. The leaders of the Canadian banking sector watched the devastating global financial crisis of 2008. They saw legendary American institutions crumble into dust overnight. They watched panic rip through the streets of New York and spread across the ocean. And while the rest of the world scrambled to put the pieces back together, the Canadian financial fortress stood completely untouched. That exact moment proved to the Canadian government that their invisible wall was worth every single penny. It validated their decision to keep the American giants out. It justified the high fees, the slow technology, and the strict monopolies. They had successfully built a financial system that could survive a direct hit from a global economic meteor. And from that day forward, the message was clear. The American banking titans would never be allowed to hold the keys to the Canadian economy. Right now, as the global economy faces entirely new threats, the Canadian financial fortress is being tested once again. Massive tech companies, digital currencies, and online-only financial platforms are constantly trying to sneak over the free, invisible wall that keeps the traditional American mega banks out. But the Canadian government is not backing down. They are doubling down on their defense. The regulators continue to update their strict laws, ensuring that no matter how the world of money changes, the control of the nation's wealth stays firmly in the hands of the Big Six. For the American banking titans sitting just across the border, the reality has finally set in. They have conquered markets in London, Tokyo, and Frankfurt. They manage trillions of dollars and possess more financial firepower than many independent nations. Yet they are forced to accept that the massive, wealthy country right next door is an impenetrable vault. Wall Street executives can only look at the guaranteed profits generated by the Canadian banking monopoly and wonder what could have been. They know they will never get a piece of that consumer banking pie. The Canadian government simply will not allow a foreign entity to hold the financial heartbeat of its citizens in its hands. But the ultimate question remains, who is the real winner in this silent war? The Canadian government gets absolute stability and the power to sleep peacefully during global market crashes. The domestic banks get a guaranteed monopoly, raking in billions of dollars in profits every single quarter without ever having to fight off American competitors. The only ones paying the actual price are the everyday citizens. Every single time a local resident pays a high monthly account fee, gets charged for a simple electronic transfer, or accepts a lower interest rate on their savings, they are paying the invisible tax of this fortress. They are personally funding the wall that keeps Wall Street out. In the end, this quiet blockade is a masterclass in national self-defense. The United States chose the path of explosive, high-risk financial capitalism. Accepting the brutal boom and bust cycles as the cost of doing business, Canada looked directly at that chaos, decided the risk was entirely too high, and built an unbreakable bunker instead. It is a massive financial trade-off that has completely shaped the history of North America. And as long as the fear of an economic meltdown exists, that invisible border wall will remain standing tall. No amount of money, power, or influence from the United States will ever be enough to buy the keys to the Canadian vault.